Helen woke that April morning, as she did every day, to the soft sound of the wind rustling the kitchen curtain and the habit of calling for Goofy, her old mutt, before she even set foot on the floor. At 73, she kept a disciplined and delicate routine, as if every gesture in the house had been sewn together by her over decades. She baked homemade bread on Tuesdays, watered her orchids with filtered water, and wrote letters she never sent. She had lived alone since her husband's death, back in her 40s, but she had never truly felt lonely, at least not until recently. In that moment, her life revolved around an obstinate faith in affection, the idea that caring well for someone, even someone who had never asked to be cared for, would one day bring some form of return. Before we continue, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this. Intense, real, and that truly move us. That particular day, Helen was preparing a basket with blackberry jam and buttery cookies for Colin and Vanessa, who had promised to stop by that late afternoon. The couple was excited, she told herself, about the arrival of their first child, a piece of news that had left Helen in tears of joy a week before when she learned of the pregnancy. She'd already set aside knitted baby clothes, a navy blue blanket she had begun to make, and planned to renovate the back bedroom to welcome her grandchild. That was how her mind worked, always one step ahead, always imagining beautiful futures for people who, for a long time, had shown no hint of reciprocity. And even in the face of Colin's indifference, he had seemed to see her only as an obligation for years. Helen insisted on believing that love could conquer all. Until that morning, when by accident she heard something that would change everything. The noise came from the hallway. Helen, barefoot and with flour-covered hands, realized Colin's phone had been left on the living room dresser during their last visit. She was only going to pick it up to turn off a speakerphone call that wouldn't stop ringing. But before she could move away, she heard his voice, loud and harsh, and Vanessa's on the other end, more curt than usual. She fell for it perfectly. You should have seen the old lady's face when I mentioned the pregnancy. She transferred the money without even asking for tests. There was a pause. Helen's blood ran cold. We need to settle the insurance before the holiday, darling. I've already booked the chalet near the trail. We just need to make it look like an accident. It was as if the floor had vanished beneath her feet. For a moment, Helen thought she had misheard, that perhaps it was a cruel joke, a performance, anything but the truth. She hung up the phone with a trembling hand, as though touching something filthy. She sat on the sofa with the vacant expression of someone who has just heard her own sentence. She did not cry. She did not scream. For the first time in many years, Helen fell into absolute silence, a silence that did not come from outside, but from within, dense, cold, paralyzing. For minutes, she stared at the wall as though trying to stitch what she had heard into the image she still held of Colin. The boy she had nursed with donated milk, taught to tie his shoelaces, defended from school bullies, and who at 8 had whispered, "You're my real mother." That memory now felt like a poorly rehearsed play. Everything Helen had believed in began to crumble there, on that clear, ordinary morning that would never be ordinary again. Helen did not leave the house that day. She did not call anyone, not even the doctor who was supposed to visit her for her high blood pressure. It was not fear. It was a kind of paralysis she did not know, a silent exhaustion. She closed the windows, turned off the oven where the bread was still baking, and sat in the guest room, where she kept Colin's old things. She remained there, motionless, staring at a box of toys he had left behind in his teens when he traded his mother's house for a college friend's modern apartment. Inside the box, among Lego pieces, a red toy car with loose wheels and a yellowed photo of them at the zoo, Helen in a pink cap with a wide smile, Colin squinting in the sun, his teeth still crooked. "You will grow up to be better than your father," she used to say. At that moment, sitting in the dark, she was certain he had not only failed to be better, he had become worse. Hours later, the phone rang. It was Vanessa, her voice sweet, theatrical, asking if her mother-in-law wanted them to come earlier to bring dinner and spend some time together. Helen took a deep breath. She no longer trembled or hesitated. She replied with her usual kindness, in that grandmotherly voice they were used to manipulating. "Of course, dear. I'll have everything ready when you arrive." As soon as she hung up, she went to the kitchen and turned off the oven. The smell of burnt bread filled the room, but Helen barely noticed. She grabbed her recipe notebook and began listing what she had in the pantry. Expired bacon, bouillon cubes, margarine with hydrogenated fat. A plan, still in its infancy, began to take shape. It would not be revenge. It would be justice, her way. Late that afternoon, Colin and Vanessa arrived full of rehearsed affection. He wore a wrinkled dress shirt and that strong cologne Helen had given him on his last birthday, but that he only used when he wanted to impress. Vanessa appeared with a box of expensive chocolates and a broad, insincere smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How is the world's most beautiful future, Grandma?" she said, exaggerating her sweetness as she moved in for a hug. Helen reciprocated, hugging them both gently, as though testing how much of that theater she could still endure. They were there not out of love, but out of self-interest, and now she knew it. Every touch, every glance, every gesture seemed scripted. It was like watching her own life turn into a second-rate play. During dinner, Helen served rice drenched in oil, reheated beans with fatty sausage, and a chicken pie loaded with industrial seasonings. They ate enthusiastically, praising every detail, saying nothing in the world compared to Mother Helen's cooking. The irony almost made Helen laugh. She watched them closely, their hand movements, the way Vanessa avoided eye contact when talking about the non-existent baby, how Colin smeared too much butter on his bread and forgot to say thank you. Years ago, she would have cried tears of joy to see them gathered at her table. Now, every minute of that scene confirmed. They did not love her, had never loved her. What hurt was not the betrayal, but the realization that everything she had given was wasted. Still, she kept her smile. The role of the naive old lady had to remain convincing. After all, to defeat a predator, you must first let him think he has already won. That same night, after the couple left with containers full of food and empty promises to come back soon, Helen washed the dishes calmly, without hurry, as though cleaning not just the plates, but years of illusions. Every soaped plate was a memory reorganized, every rinsed pot, a piece of the narrative dismantled. She did not cry. The pain had become a silent focus, a kind of raw lucidity guiding her steps. She climbed to the attic, where she kept old documents, shoeboxes of forgotten letters, and the folder in which she had filed the life insurance policy Colin had once convinced her to sign, just in case. She read every line by the yellow glow of the lamp, glasses perched on her nose, brow furrowed. It was all there, the $1 million payout, the primary beneficiary, specific clauses for accidents on trails and in remote areas, the confirmation she needed. In the days that followed, Helen maintained her routine unchanged. She visited the market on Wednesdays, went to church on Sundays, replied to Vanessa's messages with heart emojis and sweet phrases like, "Take good care of my grandson." But inside, everything was calculation. She began studying recipes that masked natural sedatives, hiding small doses in creamy desserts and thick juices, discreetly testing their effects in minimal portions. Meanwhile, she installed an app on her phone to track their location, using some motherly concern excuse. She bought, paying in cash, energy bars in packaging identical to Vanessa's favorites and a reinforced first aid kit she stashed in her car. Every gesture was millimetrically planned, but executed with the calm of someone who had spent her whole life caring, and now simply shifted the focus of her care. This time, she would save no one. She would only save herself. The following Friday, Colin arrived alone. He said Vanessa was feeling nauseous because of the pregnancy and preferred to rest. Helen feigned concern, asked if her daughter-in-law was taking vitamins, offered ginger tea with honey and lemon. He accepted, as one accepts a perfunctory favor, and flopped onto the sofa as he did in his teenage years, legs splayed, phone in hand, complete inattentiveness. Helen watched every gesture, memorizing patterns. When he casually asked if she had thought about putting the house in their name soon to make things easier if something happens, she smiled, said yes, that she was already researching the paperwork. "You know, Mum, these things save headaches later." He spoke as if negotiating a used car. With practical urgency and a glint in his eye, she now knew how to read. Pure greed. Later, while he ate a slice of banana cake, the third one, already showing the first light effects of drowsiness, Helen struck up a conversation about the hike they would take next week. Colin confirmed everything naturally, as if it were a simple family outing. "The trail is easy, nothing dangerous. It'll do you good to get out a bit." Helen replied that she was excited, that she had already set aside her sneakers, and even a sun hat. Inside, however, the countdown had begun. She knew exactly what to pack, the moment she would pretend to stumble, the excuse for carrying her own backpack. Colin, naive in his own arrogance, believed he controlled the game. He did not realize that over all those years, Helen had never stopped observing, absorbing, learning. What he saw as weakness was, in truth, long preparation. On the eve of the trip, Helen washed her clothes in the backyard sink as she had done for years, even though she owned a machine. It was the kind of habit she kept because she felt it gave her better control of the process, and now, more than ever, she needed to be in control. As she scrubbed the dish towels vigorously, she thought of Goofy. It had been weeks since the dog disappeared, and she pretended to herself there was still hope, but deep down, she knew. Colin's expression when she mentioned the dog's name for the last time had been the answer. A slight eye roll, as though scornful of her attachment to something insignificant. Helen asked no more. Discovering he had abandoned the animal, probably left on some road or handed to a stranger, was the final confirmation that that bond was dead. Goofy was not just a dog, he was the last emotional bridge between her and the boy she once called her son. The night before the outing, Helen packed her backpack with almost surgical precision. A thermos of calming herbal tea for herself, 2 others labeled refreshing juice for the couple, each dosed with a mild sedative. The energy bars stuffed with ingredients that would cause drowsiness, nausea, and mental confusion were wrapped in foil, identical to the ones Vanessa usually bought. She also packed a pocket knife, not for defense, but for precaution. She attached a card with her blood type and a copy of her ID, just in case. Helen knew that, despite all the planning, she was still an elderly woman on a trail, vulnerable, exposed. But she also knew that for the first time in her life, she was doing something for herself, not out of need, not out of love, not out of hope, but simply to survive. The morning of the hike dawned clear, with a spotless sky and that typical scent of damp earth that precedes hot days. Helen dressed calmly, put on her cap, laced her comfortable sneakers, and checked her backpack for the 3rd time. Colin arrived on time, driving the rental car with contained enthusiasm, as though trying to maintain an air of normalcy. Vanessa was quieter than usual, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses and her lips pale. "It's just a walk, Mom," Colin said as he helped her into the car. Helen smiled. "The last time I went on a trail, you still wore diapers," she replied, her voice firm but gentle. During the drive, they made small talk, as though on a Sunday outing. Yet the tension filled every silence, every forced pause. Helen felt the air thick with unspoken intentions. Upon reaching the trailhead, Helen feigned surprise at the beauty of the place. It truly was lovely. Dense foliage, birdsong, and a dirt path winding among the trees. Vanessa handed out the drinks and bars, and Colin adjusted his mother's backpack before they all began the walk. The climb was gentle at first, but Helen feigned fatigue from the first steps. She paused to drink water, to adjust her shoe, to feign back pain. "Take it easy, love. She's old," Vanessa said, trying to mask her disdain with a joking tone. Helen absorbed the comment serenely. She let them underestimate her resilience. It was all part of the plan. She knew that the more they believed in her fragility, the more certain they would be that she posed no threat. And it was precisely that blind confidence she needed to turn the tables. About an hour into the hike, they reached a natural lookout, a clearing surrounded by rocks and tall trees. It was the perfect spot for the break, as Colin had planned. He stepped away a few paces, pretending to scout a good place for them to sit, while Vanessa offered the juices and bars, disguising her anxiety with forced friendliness. Helen accepted, thanking them as always, and swapped the bottles when Vanessa was distracted, cleaning her glasses. She hid the real sedative-laced bottle in the backpack's secret compartment. Then she discreetly bit off the corner of one bar to sample its tampered contents and placed it back in its paper bag with the same colorful label. It was astonishing they had not realized underestimating her was yet again their fatal mistake. If this part made you tense as though you were there with her, comment below what you would have done in Helen's place. I want to know your opinion. Minutes later, Colin returned, smiling. I found a nice spot up ahead, flatter and shaded. Helen agreed to continue, feigning excitement. They walked a bit further until the couple suggested a final stop. Helen sat on the largest rock, removed her hat, and said she needed to recharge. The couple opened their own snacks, drank the juices, and there, in that disguised calm, the trap was complete. In less than 20 minutes, the first signs appeared. Vanessa began to sweat, and Colin complained of dizziness. It must be the heat, he murmured, trying to maintain his composure. Helen watched them with the coldness of someone who had spent her entire life studying their weaknesses. Maybe the trail was too much for you, she said, rising calmly. When they leaned back, visibly affected, Helen gathered the remnants of the food and packed her backpack. It was time to leave. But fate had one more chapter to insert into that improbable script. On the way back along the trail, now alone, Helen felt her heart race, not with fear, but with something approaching relief. For the first time, she did not have to pretend, please, or expect recognition. She walked with firm steps, despite aching knees and sweat running down her back. Then, nearly at the end of the path, she heard a faint groan from the woods to her left. She stopped, waited a few seconds, and heard it again. It was a human sound, muffled and insistent. On impulse, she brushed aside the branches and followed the narrow dirt trail. That's when she saw him. A man on the ground, bleeding, his face partially covered by leaves, breathing irregularly. At first she thought he was dead, but as she approached, he moved. "Help," he murmured weakly. Helen knelt slowly, ignoring the pain in her legs, and checked his vital signs. The man was weak but alive. She brushed the dirt from his face and recognized with silent shock the name she had seen so many times in the emails Colin left open on his laptop: Leonard Graham, a prominent CEO, a constant target of Colin's failed attempts to secure investment for his floundering startup. Leonard's face was swollen, as if he had been struck, perhaps more than once. Helen understood without words. He had been attacked right there in those woods, and she could not leave him. She fashioned an improvised tourniquet. From her scarf, cleaned his wounds with the first aid kit she had brought, and with an effort she did not know she still possessed, helped him to his feet. "Hold on, I'm getting you out of here." And for the first time that day, she was not merely fleeing. She was rescuing someone, and perhaps unknowingly rescuing herself as well. It took nearly an hour to get out of the forest. Leonard hobbled, supported by Helen's shoulder, who used every ounce of remaining control not to show exhaustion. Every step was a victory against pain, age, and everything they had believed about her. When they reached the roadside where cars were parked, Helen helped him sit in the shade of a tree and discreetly called a private rescue service. "I found an injured man on the trail. He's conscious but hurt. Don't say I called." She gave the location, hung up, and put her phone in airplane mode. Before he could protest, she explained, "It's safer that way. When they find you, it'll be better if you don't. Remember who helped you." Leonard tried to speak, but coughed and nodded with a grateful, confused look. Helen smiled, handed him a bottle of water, and returned to her car before the ambulance arrived. At the wheel, Helen remained silent. She did not turn on the radio or take any detours. She drove straight home, feeling adrenaline gradually give way to a liquid fatigue. Upon parking, she entered directly, without looking around, and locked the doors with 2 turns of the key. She took off her shoes, washed her face, and stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her eyes were red, but in them was a newfound resolve. She opened her laptop and, for the first time in weeks, accessed her bank account. She began transferring the remaining funds to a new account, one she had opened weeks before under her maiden name, off Colin's radar. Then, she pulled the folders of documents from her cabinet, sorted receipts of all the couple's expenses over the past months, and printed detailed statements of the trip they had taken to Buenos Aires, ostensibly a gift from Helen, but entirely charged to Colin's credit card, which he had allowed her to use. Everything had been meticulously documented. The next morning, Helen woke early, body sore but mind alert. She made strong black coffee, spread butter on her bread with her usual precision, and laid out on the kitchen table the envelopes with her evidence. One for Colin, another for Vanessa. She included copies of the insurance policy, bank statements, credit card charges, and printed messages he thought he had deleted. Each paper was a mirror of the betrayal. When she finished, she placed everything in a cardboard box, along with the few personal items of theirs still in her home. A fake picture frame with a generic ultrasound, a pink toothbrush with bent bristles, and a festival t-shirt Colin had forgotten there. Beside the box, she left the new house keys, sealed inside an empty envelope. The locks had been changed the night before. Helen did not wait for them. She went downtown, donated the couple's clothes, removed Colin's name as an emergency contact from her health clinic and pharmacy records, cancelled his banking authorizations, and removed his name from any remaining official documents. At every stop, it was as if she erased a line from her past. That afternoon, she hired a cleaning service and asked them to empty the old guest room, the one she always kept ready for when her son decided to show up. This time, she was not expecting anyone. That night, she received a message from Colin. "What's going on? The key won't open the lock." Helen replied with a short, emotionless voice note. "Come by tomorrow. We have some things to discuss. Bring Vanessa." For the first time, she set the meeting, and this time there was no invitation, only a sentence. Colin arrived early afternoon, eyes narrowed in anger and tone impatient as someone used to controlling the environment. Vanessa followed behind, dressed in forced sobriety, as if sensing the performance would no longer hold. Helen greeted them on the porch, seated with a cup of tea in her hands, as though nothing was out of place. "Sit down. This won't take long." Colin ignored the offer. "What's happening, Mom? What is this joke?" Helen did not reply immediately. She merely pointed to the box on the iron table, next to the organized folders. "This is yours, and this," she said, touching the papers calmly, "is everything I've gathered over these years. Every cent, every lie, every farce." Vanessa, pale, swallowed hard. Colin forced a nervous laugh. "You've lost your mind, haven't you? Why are you making a scene?" Helen stood. Her eyes were calm, but her voice came out firm, without tremor. "You are not my son." Silence fell like a bomb. "You never were. You are the product of the affair that ended my marriage. I raised you anyway. I gave you everything I had. Love, home, education, health. Even what I couldn't give, I gave. And do you know what I got in return? This?" She pushed the papers toward him. "A plot, a plan to kill me, a grotesque performance." Vanessa tried to interrupt, but Helen raised her hand, cutting her off. "No need to deny it. I heard everything, and I know about the insurance. I know every detail." Colin's face drained of color. For the first time, he was completely exposed. Helen did not shout, did not cry, did not break anything. She simply gave them what they deserved. The truth, raw and naked, without affection, without escape. Colin stood for a few seconds, speechless. He tried to form a reaction, but nothing worked. The weight of the revelation, the shame, the certainty they had lost control, it all showed on his sweaty, trembling face. "You can't do this. The house is mine too. I've lived here." Helen stepped forward slowly, with the same calm she would use to shoo an insect from a tablecloth. "You lived here because I let you, because I chose to love you. It was never an obligation. Now, it's over." She handed him the fake deed he thought was final, with his name in bold. "This one is just to frame you. The real deed is filed in another registry, in another state, in my maiden name. You never owned a thing, Colin. You only received because I wanted you to. And now, I no longer do." Vanessa began to cry, perhaps from fear, perhaps from anger, perhaps from pure shame. "We were desperate, Helen. We thought you wouldn't last long, and—" Helen cut her off with a look. "I know. You were. And counting on my death. Too bad it didn't work out, right?" She handed over the final envelope containing all the expenses of the trip she had encouraged, miles earned in her name but paid for with Colin's card. "Keep this too. The costs are all yours. Officially now." The two stood there, unsure whether to argue, apologize, or beg. But Helen left no room for any of that. She took a step back, looked at them as if they were strangers, and said, "You have 10 minutes to get off my porch. After that, I'll call the police." And she turned her back with the same resolve as someone finally closing a door, inside and out. If you found that moment powerful, like the video right now, this story deserves to be shared. They left without another word. Colin kicked the gate as he exited, and Vanessa walked away with her head down, eyes swollen, steps unsteady. Helen watched from the window but felt neither pleasure nor immediate relief. She felt a different kind of silence, dense, as though the world had paused for a second to confirm it had really happened. She closed the curtains, locked every door, and allowed herself to sit in the living room armchair, the same one where years earlier she had fallen asleep with Colin in her arms, still a child, after a fever crisis. So many moments lived there, and none of them had been enough to prevent what he became. She thought of crying but could not. Her body seemed wholly occupied by a profound exhaustion, not of age, but of soul. The truth was, she had not lost her son, because he was never hers. What she lost was the illusion that love alone was enough. In the days that followed, Helen relearned how to live in the void. She rebuilt her routine, but this time only for herself. She planted herbs in the small backyard garden, dusted off the book she had stopped reading, and began cooking only what she truly enjoyed without worrying that Colin doesn't eat that, or Vanessa prefers this. The house grew quieter, yes, but it was a silence that did not hurt. It was a clean silence. The phone did not ring, and she did not seek to know if they were okay, not out of spite, but because she now understood caring for herself was, finally, the priority. One Thursday morning, she received a letter from an unknown sender. Inside was only a simple card with a short message. "Thank you for saving me. I am alive because of you. L." Helen smiled for the first time in weeks, not because she felt important, but because she felt alive. Leonard's message was a small nod from fate, as if the universe confirmed she had done the right thing. Days later, another envelope arrived, this time bearing his company's logo. Inside was a discreet invitation to breakfast downtown, with no mention of what happened on the trail. Just an address, a time, and his signature, Leonard Graham. Helen hesitated for 2 days, not out of insecurity, but out of surprise. How long had it been since someone invited her to something without hidden motives? She dressed simply and went. The cafe was charming, with plants in the windows and the smell of fresh bread. Leonard was already there, his arm still in a sling but his gaze calm. He rose with effort when he saw her and smiled. "You came. I thought you might not." Helen simply replied, "I'm not the type to run away anymore." The conversation was light and fluid, like between two survivors who don't need to over-explain. Leonard did not press for details about the rescue, and Helen did not ask what had led him to that situation. He said he would take time away from the company to reassess partnerships and restructure. You spend your whole life trusting the wrong people until you almost lose everything. She nodded slightly. At the end of the meeting, Leonard placed a small envelope on the table. It's not money, not a reward. It's just an invitation. Inside was the name of a philanthropic foundation he was revamping and a proposal for Helen to join as a board member. People like, you see what most ignore. She did not respond then. She went home with the envelope in hand, feeling perhaps for the first time that something good was beginning, not as a debt owed, but as a genuine possibility. In the days that followed, Helen reflected on the invitation, not for the opportunity itself, but for what it represented. Someone who saw her beyond the sacrificial mother, the lonely widow, the woman forgotten by her own story. It was rare to feel recognized without giving everything of yourself first. She sat in the garden, barefoot on the grass with a cup of tea, wondering if she was still capable of starting something new. The answer came from within, without noise or euphoria, just a serene sense that yes, it was possible. Because unlike before, she expected nothing from anyone. She sought no validation, no return, no conditional affection. What came would come, and what did not come, she was enough unto herself. For the first time, she was not waiting for someone to choose her. She had chosen herself. That same day, she found Goofy's collar in a dresser drawer, hidden under old cloths. Her stomach tightened. His name was still written in red tape, faded by time. She cried, not in despair, but in true mourning. A cry that did not demand consolation. It was a farewell from someone who understood, with the hardest pain, that some losses have no compensation. She buried the collar in the basil bed as a symbolic gesture and remained there for a few minutes in silence. Goofy had been her last pure, unconditional love, without manipulation or hidden intentions, and yet he was gone. But what Helen learned was that some absences teach more than forced presences. She stood, wiped her hands on her trousers, and went back inside. Rice was simmering on the stove, clothes were on the line, and an email from Leonard awaited her reply. Life did not restart with a celebration. It restarted like this: simple, firm, and whole. The following week, Helen accepted the Foundation's invitation. She began slowly, reviewing social projects, offering suggestions, organizing files. Nothing grandiose, nothing requiring titles or formal experience, just listening, sensitivity, and common sense. Qualities she had always had, but that no one had ever valued. She started going to the office twice a week, taking the bus with other seniors, carrying her cloth tote with homemade lunch and a notebook. The place was simple, but full of life, people from all walks of life, wanting to make a difference. Helen did not speak much, but when she did, everyone listened, and that was new. It was comforting. Gradually, she felt part of something larger than her pain. It was on one of those work days that she received a call from the hospital. Colin had been admitted with severe exhaustion, high blood pressure, and a suspected panic attack. Vanessa was with him, emotionally unstable, and they were asking for Helen. The nurse explained they did not know who else to call. Helen thanked her, noted the details, and hung up. She held the phone for a moment, looking out the window. There was no anger, no pity, no desire to fix anything, only a certainty that washed over her like a wave. She owed that story nothing more. The pain that for so long kept her bound to the idea that she had to save Colin at all costs was now giving way to another feeling: freedom. She knew that if she went there, she would relive the cycle. If she welcomed them again, he would return. And she was no longer willing to let anyone confuse compassion with servitude. This time, she chose not to go. That night, Helen slept in peace. For the first time in many years, she did not wake in the middle of the night thinking about what she had done or failed to do for someone else. She woke to the sound of birds on the window ledge and allowed herself a few minutes lying still, unhurried, simply feeling her body light in the bed. She rose and went straight to the kitchen, made fresh coffee, grilled her bread, and spread plum jam she had made days before. There was no rush, no urgency, no one to please but herself. It was an ordinary morning, but there was something sacred about it, the total absence of fear. Helen no longer expected anyone to love her. She sought no redemption, no return. All she needed was already there, the peace of someone who survived. As she watered her plants, she received a message from Leonard. Nothing grandiose, just a photo of a sunflower blooming in the Foundation's garden, with the caption, "First flower of the season, thought you'd like it." Helen smiled, pressing her phone to her chest for a moment. It was not romance, not a promise. It was care, a simple gesture, without ulterior motives, without manipulation. And that was rare enough to be precious. She replied with a photo of her basil growing at home, alongside a short phrase, "We're blooming over here too." Then she returned to her routine. She folded clothes on the line, sorted groceries to donate over the weekend, and put on an old record on the turntable. Deep down, she knew, there is no happy ending like in books. There is reconstruction, there is clarity, there is choice. And in that instant, Helen was simply that, an ordinary woman with an extraordinary story, who had the courage to close the cycle that was killing her, and in its place begin something new. As weeks passed, Helen walked through the neighborhood more often. She no longer avoided glances or withdrew when someone struck up a conversation. Sometimes she stopped at the bakery for a black coffee at the counter and listened to the baker's loud stories and self-amused laughter. Other times, she sat in the square watching children play and thought of nothing. It was as if she were slowly unearthing pieces of herself that had been buried by years of renunciations and silence. She cared for her home with lightness, as someone who no longer expected visitors. She sang while mopping the floor, rearranged the furniture whenever she wanted a change of scenery, and left notes for herself on the fridge door. Simple reminders that she now lived for herself. Leonard remained present, but never invasive. He sent books with brief notes, invited her to exhibitions, shared recipes. Their relationship settled in a rare, mature place, that of respect. There was no neediness between them, only mutual admiration and a sincere desire to be near each other. One day, he took her to a new cultural center, where teenagers from vulnerable communities performed plays and presented artistic projects. Helen watched in silence, tears welling in her eyes. At the end, she turned to Leonard and said, "I would have created a place like this if I hadn't spent so much time trying to fix what had no cure." He replied gently, "But now you can." And she believed him. Not because she needed a mission, but because she finally understood. Giving the world your best does not require sacrifice. It requires awareness. What once was blind devotion was now a lucid choice. Helen had finally understood that love is not insistence. True love is shared freedom. A month later, Helen received a handwritten letter with recognizable handwriting. It was from Colin. The envelope bore no requests or demands, only remorse. He wrote that he had lost everything: the company, his friends, Vanessa's trust. He said she left him shortly after his collapse at the hospital, and that he now lived alone in a small rented apartment, trying for the first time to understand what it meant to care for himself without depending on anyone. He ended the letter with, "Forgive me, if it's still possible." Helen read every line carefully, folded the paper neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into the last drawer of her desk without replying. Not out of anger, but because she understood that forgiveness is not reconnection. Sometimes forgiving means simply not carrying it with you anymore and moving on without looking back. In the days that followed, Helen did not mention the letter to anyone. She returned to her foundation work, helped organize a new fundraiser for flood-affected families, and attended meetings with a discreet sparkle in her eyes. When asked about her personal life, she replied with a gentle smile, "Now it's exactly how I like it." At home, she organized old albums and tore up photos that no longer brought her good memories. She kept only those that truly belonged to her story, even the difficult ones, but only those. One day, she found a photo from her wedding, taken just before the separation. She studied her younger face, hopeful and full of doubts. Instead of sadness, she felt compassion, not for the woman in the photo, but for the journey she had endured to arrive where she was. That was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a life lived by choice, not obligation. Over time, Helen became recognized in the neighborhood, not as Colin's mother, nor as the reclusive widow on the corner. Now she was the herb lady, the woman who helped at the foundation, who taught simple recipes to single mothers at community gatherings. She was sought for advice, not charity, and that changed everything. Recognition based on who she was, not what she offered or endured. Some neighbors began visiting her regularly, bringing cakes, old newspapers, or simply the desire to chat. Helen welcomed them all with her usual kindness, but now without losing herself in the process. She was learning to say no when necessary, to end conversations she no longer wanted to have, to stand up for herself without fear. She was a new version of herself, firmer, calmer, whole. One Saturday morning, while walking through the market, Helen paused in front of a stall where adoption puppies wagged their tails energetically from cardboard boxes. One, a black pup with white patches on its eyes and paws, looked at her as though it recognized her. She smiled unconsciously. The vendor approached, saying this one was the calmest of the litter and that no one had shown interest. Helen crouched, extended her hand, and the puppy came without hesitation, pressing its nose against her fingers before lying down. In that simple, spontaneous gesture was something deeper, the possibility of a new bond. No past, no promises, no expectations, just presence. "What's his name?" she asked. "He doesn't have one yet," replied the young man. Helen thought for a moment, then said, "He'll be called Peace." And she took him home, not as a replacement for anything, but as company for everything she still had yet to live. In the months that followed, Helen lived simply but intensely. Each day felt laden with meaning, not for grand events, but for all the little things once overlooked. The morning light streaming through the window, the smell of bread baking, the soft purr of Peace sleeping at her feet while she read any old book. These were more than enough. She learned to enjoy her own company. She sometimes spoke aloud to herself, but now without sadness. Sometimes she laughed at her own memories. Sometimes she was moved by old letters. She no longer needed to erase the past to move forward, only to reorganize it within herself. It was not about forgetting. It was about refusing to let it define her. Leonard remained nearby with spaced-out, sincere meetings. Sometimes they had dinner together in companionable silence, no need to fill every gap with words. Other times, they spent afternoons discussing ideas for new projects, like two teenagers excited by possibilities. He never asked about Colin again, and Helen never needed to explain. It was as if he understood that what mattered was not what she had lived through, but what she chose to live from now on. And that was rare. Gradually, she realized that love, when light, does not weigh you down. When true, it does not pressure you. It simply settles beside you without invading. And that was enough. Colin never wrote again. And deep down, Helen knew he might never return, not as she had dreamed for so many years. But that absence was no longer a wound. It was a fact. She had done all she could, and then what was necessary. Now she did what she wanted. She knew that if he ever decided to change, it would no longer be her responsibility, and that realization was true liberation. She felt no hatred, no pity, no guilt, only distance. And that distance was healthy. It was space. It was peace. One ordinary afternoon, as she watered the garden and watched Peace chase butterflies among the pots, Helen smiled. No music was playing, no visitors expected, nothing extraordinary, and yet everything felt right, because deep down she knew she no longer needed grand gestures to feel alive. It was enough to be whole, and now finally she was. And to never miss another intense story like this, turn on notifications and share this content with someone you know will feel every line just as you did.